Big Shaq walked into a luxury store, dressed down, unnoticed, underestimated. The store manager barely spared him a glance, her trained eye dismissing him as just another broke customer. But when he asked for the most expensive watch, the air shifted, the smirks faded, the game changed. Because the man they mocked didn't just have money, he had power. And seconds later, with a quiet, controlled fury, he fired her on the spot. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun cast long, golden streaks across the city, bouncing off the windows of towering skyscrapers and bustling streets. It was the kind of day where life moved fast, where people hurried past each other, caught up in their own worlds, unaware of the stories walking beside them. Among the crowd, one man stood out, not just because of his towering height or the way people instinctively turned to look at him, but because of the quiet, unshakable presence he carried. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to those who knew him, moved through life like an invisible giant. Not because people didn't recognize him, but because they refused to see beyond the surface. A man of his stature, his build, his skin color, he knew how people perceived him. Some admired him. Some feared him. Others dismissed him altogether. And that was fine. Shaq had learned long ago that true power wasn't in demanding respect, it was in knowing you didn't need to. Today was supposed to be simple. No flashy cars, no entourage. Just him, moving through the city, blending in as much as a 7'1" man ever could. He wore a plain gray hoodie, loose jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had seen better days. To anyone watching, he looked like just another guy. That was the point. But even stripped of his fame, stripped of the wealth that followed his name, Shaq could still feel the weight of judgment pressing against him like a heavy fog. It was in the way the cafe worker hesitated before handing him his coffee, fingers twitching ever so slightly. It was in the way a woman clutched her purse a little tighter when he walked by. It was in the way the man in a tailored suit sized him up with a glance, assuming he knew everything he needed to. Shaq had been here before. Different streets, different faces, same story. He never let it get to him, not visibly at least. Instead, he tucked his hands into his pockets, took a slow sip of his coffee, and kept moving. Today, he had one errand to run. He turned a corner, stepping onto the wide, pristine sidewalk in front of Ellsworth and Company, one of the city's most exclusive high-end stores. The kind of place where watches cost more than most people's rent, where employees were trained to cater only to a certain kind of customer. Shaq had been meaning to stop by for a while. Not because he needed anything. He already owned more than his share of luxury watches and tailored suits, but because he owned the store. Not that anyone inside knew that. As Shaq approached the glass doors, a valet stationed outside gave him a once-over, his expression flickering with uncertainty before settling into thinly veiled disapproval. The man didn't say anything, but Shaq could see the way his posture stiffened, the silent assessment running through his mind. Not our kind of customer. Shaq let out a slow breath, then stepped inside. The store was a world of polished marble and quiet elegance. Rows of gleaming display cases stretched across the room, showcasing watches, cufflinks, and designer accessories under soft golden lighting. Customers milled about, dressed in tailored suits and sleek dresses, sipping complimentary champagne as they browsed. And then there was Shaq. He had barely taken 3 steps inside before he felt it. The shift. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The way the air grew heavier, the way the employees stole quick glances at him, their polished smiles tightening ever so slightly. The way a well-dressed couple near the entrance instinctively stepped aside, as if he might bump into them. Shaq knew this game. He had played it too many times before. But today, he wasn't here to play. Near the center of the store, a woman stood behind one of the display cases, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail, her posture radiating sharp confidence. She was dressed in a crisp black blazer, her manicured nails tapping against the glass as she spoke to a customer. Rachel Caldwell, store manager. Shaq had read her file before. High sales numbers, strong leadership skills, a reputation for catering to the wealthy, and weeding out those who didn't belong. As Shaq approached, her gaze flickered toward him, And just like that, he saw it happen. The calculation, the assumption, the dismissal. Her smile didn't falter, but it changed, became thinner, less genuine. She straightened, giving him the kind of look one might give a stray dog wandering into a restaurant. "Sir," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. "Can I help you?" Shaq didn't miss the slight hesitation. The way her eyes flicked down to his hoodie, his jeans, his shoes, not a single designer label in sight. He could practically hear her thoughts. "He doesn't belong here. He can't afford anything here. He's wasting my time." Shaq smiled. Not big, just enough to show he knew. "I'd like to see your newest watch collection," he said, voice calm, even. Rachel didn't blink, but she didn't move either. Her fingers tapped against the glass. "Our collections are quite exclusive," she said, carefully measured. "Most of our pieces start at—" She gave him a glance, deliberate, slow. "Around 50,000. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "That a problem?" Rachel's smile stretched wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not at all," she said. But she didn't make a move to show him anything. The tension in the air thickened. Other employees were watching now, sensing the silent confrontation playing out. A couple of customers stole glances, then quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Shaq could feel the weight of their judgment, their assumptions pressing down on him. And yet, he wasn't angry, not yet. Instead, he tilted his head, studying Rachel the same way she was studying him. "Good," he said smoothly. "Then I'd like to see the most expensive watch you have." Rachel let out a small laugh, quick, sharp, disbelieving. Shaq just smiled, and in that moment, the real game began. Rachel Caldwell prided herself on her ability to read people. It was what made her the top-selling manager at Ellsworth & Company. She had spent years mastering the art of distinguishing the real buyers from the time-wasters, and she did it in mere seconds. A glance at their clothes, their shoes, the way they carried themselves. That was all she needed. And right now, the man standing in front of her was setting off every alarm. He was big. Too big, really. His presence alone taking up too much space in the pristine, high-end store. His clothes were plain, cheap-looking, the kind of outfit a man wore when he wasn't serious about spending money. No Rolex on his wrist. No custom-tailored suit. Not their kind of customer. Rachel's polished smile didn't waver, but her patience thinned the longer he stood there. The longer he took up space. She flicked her gaze toward the security guard near the entrance, then back to the man. He was still looking at her, waiting for an answer, waiting for service. Rachel barely resisted the urge to sigh. Might as well get this over with. "Our collections are quite exclusive," she said, keeping her tone professional, clipped. "They're not exactly within most people's price range." The man didn't blink. He didn't fidget, didn't even react. Instead, he simply smiled as if she had just confirmed something he already suspected. "Good," he said smoothly. "I'd like to see the most expensive watch you have." Rachel let out a small laugh before she could stop herself. It wasn't intentional, just an instinctive knee-jerk reaction, like a reflex. This guy couldn't be serious. Even the employees nearby had paused their work. Their interest peaked. They weren't outright staring, but Rachel could feel the weight of their hidden amusement, the way they were all waiting for her to handle the situation. Rachel's grip on the counter tightened. This was a waste of time, and time was money. She straightened, her polished confidence slipping into something sharper. "I'm sorry," she said, tilting her head slightly. "But perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at one of our partner stores. They have more budget-friendly options." She delivered the words with practiced elegance, her voice silky, almost kind, but the intention was anything but. Shaq finally moved. Just slightly. His eyebrow lifted, his dark eyes locking onto hers with quiet amusement. He had seen this before, 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. Rachel, however, mistook his silence for defeat. She smiled again, a tight, self-satisfied curve of the lips, and turned away, already dismissing him in her mind. Problem solved. Or so she thought. The whispers started almost immediately. Not loud enough for Rachel to hear, but Shaq caught them. "Did you see how she just shut him down? He really thought he could afford something here? Man, some people just don't get it." Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose, rolling his shoulders back. His patience was deep, well practiced. He had endured worse than this in his lifetime, but that didn't mean he enjoyed it. Rachel had already turned to assist another customer, a wealthy-looking man in a navy blue suit, someone she deemed worth her time. Her voice was brighter, warmer, completely different from the one she had used on him. Shaq watched her for a moment, then shifted his gaze to the employees nearby. They still weren't looking at him directly, but they were smirking, enjoying the moment. Shaq's jaw tightened. He wasn't one to pull rank, not over something as trivial as ego. But this wasn't ego. This was something else, and he wasn't letting it slide. Rachel was in the middle of a flawless pitch, expertly guiding her suited customer through the intricate details of an $80,000 Rolex, when a shadow fell over the glass counter. She glanced up, already irritated, ready to wave away whoever it was, until she saw him. The same man from before, still standing there, still watching her. Her fingers twitched against the glass. "Sir," she said, her patience dangerously thin now. "As I mentioned before, I'd like to speak to the owner." Rachel blinked. The request threw her off for just a second, but she recovered quickly, letting out a sharp laugh. "I'm sorry, but the owner isn't available to—" "I'll wait." There was something in his tone now. Not aggressive, not demanding, but firm, unmovable. Rachel didn't like it, and she really didn't like the fact that people were starting to notice. A few customers had turned to watch. Employees were exchanging looks. Even the security guard near the door had shifted, ready to step in. Rachel could feel her control slipping, and she hated it. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said quickly, trying to regain the upper hand. "As I said, this isn't the right place for you. But if you'd like, I can recommend—" "You don't need to recommend anything," Shaq interrupted, his voice calm, steady. "Because I already own this store." The words landed like a thunderclap. Rachel's face went blank. The entire room went still. For the first time, Rachel didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix this. The suited customer she had been helping took a small step back, his expression shifting into something like unease. The employees, who had been whispering before, were now silent. Rachel stared at Shaq, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a vice. And then, slowly, so slowly it was painful, her mind pieced it together. The way the employees had stopped talking, the way security hadn't stepped in, the way this man she had dismissed, hadn't just left when she told him to, because he didn't have to, because he wasn't just another broke customer. He was her boss. Rachel's stomach plummeted. She opened her mouth ready to, what? Apologize? Make excuses? She didn't even know. But before she could say anything, Shaq took a step closer, leaning slightly over the glass counter, and smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Not cruel, not arrogant, just measured. "Now," he said, his voice even, deliberate. "How about you show me that watch?" The store remained dead silent as Rachel, her hands slightly unsteady, reached beneath the glass and pulled out the most expensive Rolex they had in stock. The tension was thick enough to choke on. No one moved. No one spoke. Rachel carefully placed the watch on the counter, the weight of 1,000 regrets pressing down on her as she did. Shaq didn't pick it up, didn't even look at it. Instead, he kept his eyes on her, watching the way her fingers trembled, the way she swallowed hard, the way her entire perfectly curated confidence had shattered in an instant. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, Shaq exhaled a quiet chuckle. Then, with the same calm smile, he said 3 words that would haunt her forever. "You're fired." Rachel crossed her arms, her expression barely concealing the smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. This man was still here, still standing in front of her, still pretending like he belonged in this store, still acting like he had any business asking for their most expensive timepiece. Shaq remained unfazed. His posture was relaxed, hands casually tucked into the front pocket of his hoodie. But his eyes, they watched everything. Rachel let out a small, amused breath, "Sir, I don't think this is the right store for you," she said, her tone overly patient, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. "There are plenty of other places that might be more in your price range." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You don't even know my price range." Rachel barely held back a chuckle. She'd been doing this job long enough to know. The expensive buyers carried themselves with a certain confidence, a quiet arrogance, a natural entitlement to luxury. This guy? He looked like someone who spent more time in sneaker shops than luxury boutiques. She had no interest in wasting time on someone who couldn't even afford the cheapest item in the store. But Shaq didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't demand to be treated better. Instead, he smiled. Slow, unreadable. "All right," he said, nodding toward the glass case behind her. "Let's settle this. Show me the most expensive watch you have." Rachel didn't even try to hold back her laugh this time. A few of the other employees behind the counter snickered, one of them shaking his head as he whispered something to the other. Even a couple of customers nearby glanced over, picking up on the tension, sensing something was off. "You want to see the most expensive watch?" Rachel repeated, as if the very idea was ridiculous. Shaq nodded, calm as ever. "Yeah, if it's not too much trouble." Rachel exhaled through her nose, biting back the urge to roll her eyes. This was just sad. Some people really didn't know when to walk away with dignity. "Well," she said, turning toward the display case behind her, unlocking it with a delicate flick of her wrist. "If you must know, our most expensive piece is the Van Brigham Elite Chronomaster, limited edition. Handcrafted in Switzerland, only 5 ever made. This one, $275,000. She pulled it out carefully, as if handling something sacred, letting the light catch the intricate details of the diamond-encrusted bezel. "A masterpiece," she mused, running a finger along the polished band. Then she turned back to Shaq, the smirk returning. "But I think we both know, this isn't for you." She was expecting Shaq to hesitate, to backpedal, maybe even get embarrassed and finally leave. Instead, he just gave a small nod. "Cool," he said. "I'll take it." Silence. Rachel blinked, then she laughed, this time loudly. Not a polite chuckle, not a suppressed giggle. A full-blown, uncontrolled laugh right in his face. A few customers turned toward the sound, picking up on the tension. The employees behind her whispered to each other, exchanging knowing looks. One of them, Travis, a junior associate, shook his head, smirking. "Right," Rachel said, eyes gleaming with condescension. "You'll take it." Shaq's expression didn't change. He just watched her, patient as ever. "Sir," she continued as if explaining something painfully obvious, "this watch costs more than most people's homes. We don't do payment plans. We don't do layaway. And we definitely don't take Cash App." She let out a breath as if she were done with the whole thing. "Now, if you're serious about making a purchase, maybe we can look at something more reasonable." The air in the room had shifted. Everyone was watching now. Some customers pretended not to stare, sneaking glances. Employees tried to suppress their amusement, waiting for the inevitable moment when this man would realize his mistake and leave. Except one person wasn't laughing. Connor. He stood further back, near the register, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the counter. He had recognized Shaq the moment he walked in, but he had stayed quiet, watching, waiting, hoping Rachel wouldn't do what she always did when she thought someone wasn't worth her time. And now, it was too late. Rachel had no idea who she was talking to. Shaq exhaled slowly, nodding to himself, as if giving Rachel one last chance to course correct. But she didn't take it. Instead, she did something even worse. She tilted her head, lowering her voice to a mocking whisper. "Look, I don't want to embarrass you," she said, in a tone that dripped with fake sympathy. "I get it. It's fun to come in here, pretend for a few minutes, live the fantasy. But this isn't that kind of store. We deal with real money here." Shaq's smile vanished. For the first time since he stepped into the store, something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something colder. Rachel, still oblivious, turned toward one of the security guards by the entrance and lifted a manicured hand, gesturing subtly. A silent command. "Get rid of him." The guard, a a tall, bulky man with a shaved head, nodded once, adjusting the radio on his belt as he started toward Shaq. Connor stiffened, his hands curled into fists on the counter. His eyes darted between Shaq and Rachel, and for a split second, he debated stepping in. But before he could make a move, Shaq finally spoke. "You know what's funny?" His voice was quiet, but heavy. The kind of quiet that made people listen. Rachel lifted an eyebrow, still smirking. "Oh, please enlighten me." Shaq reached into his hoodie pocket. Not fast, not aggressive, calm, deliberate. And when his hand reappeared, he wasn't holding a wallet. He was holding a set of documents. Rachel frowned, the smirk slipping just slightly. "What's that supposed to be?" Shaq unfolded the papers slowly, almost casually, before setting them down on the glass counter. And when Rachel's eyes flickered toward the first line of text, her entire body went still. Connor saw it first, the unmistakable letterhead, the official company seal, the name printed clearly at the top, Shaquille O'Neal, owner. The color drained from Rachel's face so fast it was almost dizzying. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The employees behind her, who had been watching with such amused interest just moments ago, went rigid. The security guard, who had been 2 steps away from escorting Shaq out the door, froze mid-step. The entire store had stopped breathing. Shaq tapped a finger against the document. "You were saying something about real money?" His voice was smooth, controlled, but his eyes, they were steel. Rachel couldn't move. She couldn't blink, couldn't speak, because this couldn't be happening. This wasn't possible. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a customer. He wasn't just rich. He was her boss. And in that moment, Rachel knew. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Rachel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her brain refused to process what was happening. Just moments ago, she had been smirking, patronizing, mocking the man in front of her. Now she was staring at an official document that shattered everything she thought she knew. Shaquille O'Neal, owner, her boss. The reality of it hit her like a truck. Her legs felt unsteady, her hands suddenly cold. She blinked, hoping this was some kind of mistake. A prank. A misunderstanding. It wasn't. The store had fallen into an eerie, suffocating silence. Every employee, every customer, every single person in the room was frozen in place. The power dynamic had flipped so fast, so violently, it left Rachel dizzy. Shaq's expression remained unreadable, his fingers lightly tapping against the document, waiting, giving her one last chance to say something. Rachel's lips trembled before she forced out an awkward, nervous laugh. This is a joke, right?" Her voice was lighter than before, a forced attempt at humor. "I mean, you're Shaquille O'Neal. What are you doing here?" Shaq didn't smile, didn't blink, didn't let her escape. "I own this store," he said, his deep voice steady. Final. Rachel felt her stomach drop. She knew the company had big investors, silent partners. But never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that the man she had just treated like a trespasser, like a broke nobody, was the person who signed her paychecks. Connor, still standing near the register, folded his arms and leaned back, watching with satisfaction. The other employees, who had been so eager to whisper and laugh minutes ago, now stood stiffly, faces pale, eyes darting anywhere but at Rachel. She forced a tight, apologetic smile, her heart racing. "Mr. O'Neal, I had no idea. I would never—" Shaq cut her off with 3 words. "You're fired." It was a death sentence. Rachel staggered back, her breathing shallow. What? "You heard me," Shaq said, his voice calm, almost casual. But his eyes were sharp, unforgiving. Rachel's world tilted. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how things worked. She was the one who had control, the one who decided who was important and who wasn't. Not the other way around. Her throat tightened as desperation clawed at her chest. "Please, Mr. O'Neal," she said quickly, her voice cracking. I didn't mean any harm. It was a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. You have to understand." "Your job?" Shaq echoed, raising an eyebrow. And what exactly is your job, Rachel? She swallowed hard. To assist customers, of course. Shaq tilted his head slightly. All customers? Or just the ones you think can afford to be here? Rachel opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Shaq let the silence stretch. The store still hadn't moved. Customers were pretending not to listen, but their gazes flickered in her direction, eager to see how this played out. Rachel's eyes darted toward her co-workers, silently begging for help, but none of them stepped in. Not after the way she had treated them over the years. She turned back to Shaq, her voice growing more frantic. I was just following protocol. We get people all the time who come in here and pretend like they're going to buy something. You can't expect me to... Stop, Shaq said, cutting her off with one word. Rachel flinched. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. You think that's the problem? That I looked like I didn't belong? He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make her feel every word. You didn't just misjudge me, Rachel. You treated me like I wasn't even worth basic respect. Rachel clenched her jaw, trying to fight back the humiliation burning in her chest. Let me tell you something, Shaq continued, his voice calm but heavy with authority. I've been in places like this my whole life. Places where people like you take one look at me and think you already know my story. He exhaled sharply. But I'll tell you what I do know. You're arrogant. You're entitled. And worst of all, you think kindness is something you get to ration out based on how expensive someone's shoes are. Rachel felt her face heat up. It wasn't just the shame. It was the knowledge that everyone around her agreed. She took a shaky breath. I can fix this. Mr. O'Neal, please. I've been a manager here for 3 years. I know this store inside and out. I can do better. Shaq considered her for a long moment. Can you? Yes, she rushed to say, absolutely, just give me one more chance. The store held its breath. Shaq leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. And if I was just another customer? Rachel blinked, confused. What? If I wasn't Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq said, tilting his head. If I was just some guy walking in off the street and I asked you for a second chance, would you give it? Rachel's blood ran cold. Shaq let the question linger. Let her feel it. The answer was obvious. She wouldn't have. Rachel's shoulders sagged. Her voice, barely above a whisper, finally broke. I'm so sorry. Shaq studied her, the panic in her eyes, the way her pride was crumbling at her feet. Finally, he exhaled, glancing toward Connor. Who's your best salesperson? Connor blinked, caught off guard. Then, without hesitation, he said, Lena. A woman near the back of the store straightened in surprise. She was younger than Rachel, her uniform crisp, her expression a mix of confusion and hope. She had been standing quietly, watching everything unfold with wide eyes. Shaq nodded once. Promote her. Rachel's stomach dropped. Wait. Shaq turned back to her. And you? He sighed, shaking his head. Rachel, you're done here. Rachel's heart pounded. This store. Her status, her power, her reputation. It was all slipping through her fingers. She took a shaky step forward. Please, I need this job. Shaq's expression softened, just slightly. No, Rachel, he said, his voice quieter now. You need to understand what it feels like to be on the other side of the glass. Rachel's breath hitched. Shaq didn't wait for another excuse. He turned to Connor. Make sure she collects her things, and don't let her talk her way out of it. Rachel turned to Connor, her last lifeline. But he just shook his head, his expression unreadable. And just like that, it was over. As Shaq turned toward the exit, the air in the store shifted again. Employees straightened, customers whispered. And Rachel? She just stood there, frozen, her entire world in pieces. The last thing she heard before the door swung shut behind him was Connor's voice, firm and absolute. Rachel, you need to leave. Rachel sat in the dimly lit office at the back of the store, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The shock hadn't worn off. It wouldn't wear off. Not after what had just happened. She was fired. No warnings. No second chances. Just gone. Her name had meant something in this store. For 3 years, she had ruled this place. Employees feared her. Customers respected her. She controlled who received her attention and who didn't. And in just a matter of minutes, Shaquille O'Neal had taken everything from her. But now, here she was, sitting in the very office where she had once written up employees for not meeting standards, waiting for Shaq to decide what would happen to her next. The door opened. Rachel straightened, sucking in a shaky breath as Shaq stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He didn't sit. He didn't offer her a seat. He just leaned against the desk, folding his massive arms across his chest, watching her without a trace of sympathy. Rachel swallowed, her voice hoarse. "Please, Mr. O'Neal." Shaq lifted a hand, cutting her off. "Save it." Rachel's throat tightened. "You had a good run," Shaq said, his voice steady. "Made your sales. Bossed people around. Decided who mattered and who didn't." He tilted his head. "How's it feel now?" Rachel looked away, humiliation burning under her skin. Shaq let the silence stretch before exhaling. "You want your job back?" Rachel's head snapped up. Yes, I... Shaq shook his head. "Not happening." Rachel's stomach dropped. "But," he continued, watching her reaction, "I'll give you something better." Rachel frowned, confusion flickering in her tear-stained eyes. "Better?" Shaq pushed off the desk, standing at his full height, towering over her. "Tell me something," he said, pacing slowly. "Have you ever lost everything?" Rachel hesitated. "I... ever had to start over?" Her jaw clenched. "No." Shaq nodded, unsurprised. "That's the problem." Rachel didn't understand. Was this some kind of lecture? "Come with me," Shaq said, striding toward the door. Rachel didn't move at first. Then, realizing she had no other choice, she followed. The elevator ride down was silent. When the doors opened, Rachel expected Shaq to take her back into the store, to humiliate her in front of everyone again. But he didn't. Instead, he led her out of the building. Rachel blinked. "Where are we going?" Shaq didn't answer. He just kept walking. A black SUV waited at the curb. The driver barely acknowledged them as Shaq opened the back door and gestured for her to get in. Rachel hesitated. "Is this a joke?" Shaq's gaze darkened. "You think I'm laughing?" Rachel swallowed hard and climbed inside. The ride was long. The further they drove, the more Rachel's discomfort grew. They were leaving the high-end shopping district. Glass buildings and luxury cars faded into run-down apartments, cracked sidewalks, struggling businesses. Rachel shifted in her seat, uneasy. "Where are we?" Shaq didn't respond. The SUV pulled up to a small diner on the corner of a street Rachel had never heard of. The neon sign flickered above the door. Shaq got out. Rachel hesitated, then followed. The moment they stepped inside, the smell of burnt coffee and old grease filled the air. A few tired-looking customers sat in booths, hunched over their plates. The waitress behind the counter barely looked up. Rachel felt out of place. Shaq led her toward the back, where an older man, maybe late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weary expression, was wiping down a table. His uniform was faded, his hands rough. "Elliot," Shaq said. The man looked up, his tired eyes lighting with recognition. "Well, I'll be damned." Shaq smiled. "Been a while." Elliot chuckled, setting down his rag. "You finally came to try my world-famous burnt toast?" Shaq smirked. "Tempting." Then, he gestured toward Rachel. "She needs a lesson." Rachel stiffened. "Excuse me?" Elliot's gaze shifted to her. He studied her the same way she used to study customers in her store. But there was no judgment, just understanding. Shaq pulled out a chair and gestured for Rachel to sit. She didn't move. I don't get it," she said, arms crossing over her chest. "Who is this?" Shaq leaned against the counter, watching her. "This is Elliot Grayson. Used to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company." Rachel's brow furrowed. "What?" Elliot chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah. Once had a corner office, a multi-million-dollar salary, and people like you working under me." Rachel froze. Shaq nodded. "Then one bad investment, one wrong move, everything crashed." He glanced at Elliot. "How long did it take to lose it all?" Elliot exhaled. 6 months. Rachel's lips parted. I had a house in Beverly Hills, Elliot said, his voice even. A wife, a daughter in private school, then gone. The house, foreclosed. The wife, left. The money, he shrugged. Doesn't take long for people to forget your name when your bank account dries up. Rachel stared at him, her heart pounding. And now, Shaq continued, he works here, minimum wage, no fancy title, no corner office. Just another guy behind the counter, serving coffee to people who don't even bother to look him in the eye. Rachel swallowed hard. Shaq turned to her. Why do you think I brought you here? Rachel hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. Shaq's stare hardened. Because this is what happens when you think the world owes you something. Rachel felt her stomach twist. You thought you were untouchable, Shaq continued. You thought money and power meant you could treat people however you wanted. He gestured toward Elliot. And now you see what happens when life decides to humble you. Rachel felt her throat close. Shaq straightened, his voice dropping lower. You think losing your job is the worst thing that could happen? He shook his head. Rachel, you have no idea what real loss looks like. Rachel's breathing was unsteady now. Elliot gave her a small nod. It's not about the fall, he said. It's about whether you learn from it. Shaq folded his arms. So, I'm giving you a choice. Rachel blinked rapidly, snapping her gaze to him. A choice? Shaq nodded. You can walk away right now. Keep your pride. Tell yourself you were wronged. Find another job. Keep thinking the way you do, and wait for life to knock you down again. Rachel's pulse pounded. Or, Shaq said, tilting his head, you can learn. Rachel swallowed. Learn what? Shaq's expression was unreadable. What it feels like to be on the other side. Silence. Elliot studied her. If you're serious about changing, I can get you a job here. Rachel's heart stopped. What? Shaq nodded. You want a second chance? Prove you deserve it. Rachel felt her pride scream in protest. A waitress? In some rundown diner? After everything she had built? Her nails dug into her palms. I can't, then leave, Shaq said simply. Rachel's breathing was shaky. Pride or humility? The war raged inside her. Finally, she whispered, When do I start? Shaq smiled. Now, the real lesson began. Rachel adjusted the stiff black apron around her waist, the cheap fabric rough against her fingers. She had never worn anything like this before. Just days ago, she had been standing behind the counter of Ellsworth and Company, ordering employees around, deciding who deserved attention and who didn't. Now, she stood inside one of Shaq's retail stores, not as a manager, not as a buyer, but as a low-wage employee. The weight of humiliation pressed against her chest as she looked around the store. It wasn't high-end like Ellsworth and Company. The floors weren't marble, the lighting wasn't golden and soft, and there was no complimentary champagne for customers. It was a basic retail shop, the kind she had ignored her entire life. Now, it was her reality. She felt Shaq's presence before she saw him. He was standing near the entrance, watching her with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the moment she agreed to. This. Rachel swallowed hard. She had a choice. Walk away and prove she hadn't learned a thing, or stay and prove she could handle it. She took a slow breath. Then she turned to the assistant manager, a no-nonsense woman named Denise, who had been given strict instructions by Shaq. Don't go easy on her. What do I do first? Rachel asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Denise didn't smile. She handed Rachel a price scanner. Floor duty, stock shelves, fold clothes, help customers. She eyed Rachel's stiff posture. And lose the attitude. You're not in charge here. Rachel nodded tightly and turned toward the aisles. The first 10 minutes were fine. The next hour was brutal. She had never been on this side of things. Never been the one ignored, dismissed, or outright mocked by customers who barely saw her as a person. A man in a tailored suit waved her over without even looking at her. Yeah, I need a different size, he said, tossing a shirt at her. The fabric hit her arm before sliding to the floor. Rachel's jaw clenched as she bent down and picked it up, biting her tongue. She had done this exact thing to employees before. She deserved this. At least, that's what Shaq wanted her to learn. By noon, she had been talked down to, ignored, and snapped at. One woman even assumed Rachel was too uneducated to know how the store's return policy worked. Rachel wanted to scream. She wanted to yell at them, remind them who she was, tell them she wasn't like the other employees. But she wasn't Rachel, the respected store manager, anymore. She was just a worker in a name tag and apron, and nobody cared. Shaq watched from a distance. He saw the way Rachel's shoulders stiffened with every rude comment, every dismissive glance, every moment she realized she wasn't important anymore. And yet, she didn't quit. He had expected her to break by lunch, maybe throw down her apron and storm out, muttering about how this was beneath her. But she was still here, struggling, yes, but still here. Denise walked over, arms crossed. "She's taking a beating," she murmured. Shaq nodded. "Good." Denise raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, boss?" She was a nightmare at Ellsworth. The kind of person you fire and don't think twice about. Shaq exhaled. "Yeah, but I've been fired before too," Denise smirked. "Something tells me you didn't get fired for being a self-righteous snob." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, but I know what it's like to need a second chance." Denise studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, let's see if she deserves one." By mid-afternoon, Rachel's feet ached. She had never been on her feet this long, never spent this much time being ordered around instead of giving orders. Then, the moment came, the one that broke her. A woman in an expensive dress, holding 3 shopping bags from designer brands, strolled in. Rachel recognized the type immediately, someone who thought money gave them the right to act however they wanted. Rachel had been this woman not long ago. The woman barely glanced at Rachel before holding up a shirt. "This looks cheap," she said. "Do you have anything more high-end?" Rachel forced a polite smile. "Our premium collection is near the back. I'd be happy to show you." The woman sighed loudly and waved her off. "You know what? Forget it. I'll just go somewhere better." She turned to her friend and muttered, "I don't know why they hire these people. You'd think they'd find employees with a little class." Rachel felt her stomach twist. For a split second, she saw herself, saw every moment she had dismissed an employee, judged them, treated them like they were beneath her. She wanted to scream, to fire back with an insult of her own, but instead, she just stood there, silent. The woman left without another word. Rachel let out a slow, shaky breath, her pride crumbling. And when she turned around, her eyes landed on Shaq, watching her. He had seen everything. He didn't speak. He didn't smirk. He just nodded. Rachel looked away, because for the first time in her life, she was starting to understand. The store closed at 8. Rachel sat in the break room, staring down at her hands, feeling exhausted in a way she had never known before. She heard footsteps. A moment later, Shaq took a seat across from her, his massive frame dwarfing the chair. He didn't speak, just watched her. Finally, Rachel exhaled. "I get it." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Rachel looked up, her throat tight. "I didn't before. I thought people like me deserved success. That the ones working these jobs just weren't ambitious enough." She let out a bitter laugh. "But today, I worked harder than I ever did at Ellsworth. And no one cared. No one respected me. They just," she swallowed, "treated me like I didn't matter." Shaq nodded slowly. Rachel's hands curled into fists. "I was awful to people." Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, what now?" Rachel blinked. "You want your old life back?" he asked. "Or do you want to actually change?" Rachel hesitated. For the first time, she wasn't sure. She had spent years climbing the ladder, chasing status, thinking money was the only thing that mattered. But today, for the first time, she had felt what it was like to be on the other side. And it hurt. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Shaq studied her for a long moment before standing. "Then figure it out." Rachel looked up. "You're not firing me?" Shaq smirked. "Not yet." Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of everything she had just learned. Rachel was finally starting to settle into the rhythm of her new job. It had been 2 weeks since she started working in the retail store, and every day had been a test. Customers still dismissed her. Some barely made eye contact. Others waved her off like she was an inconvenience. But Rachel no longer fought it. She had learned to swallow her pride, nod, and move on. And strangely, something inside her was changing. She didn't just hear people's words anymore. She felt them. She saw the way customers treated the other employees, how some of them looked embarrassed when their cards got declined, how others hesitated before asking about sales as if they were afraid of being judged. She saw the way the world had always been, but she had been too blinded by her own arrogance to notice. For the first time in her life, Rachel understood what humility felt like, and she hated that it had taken her so long to learn. It was a slow afternoon when it happened. Rachel was restocking a display near the register when she heard the voice. A voice she recognized instantly. "Oh my God," the man laughed, loud enough to turn heads. "Rachel Caldwell? Is that really you?" Rachel froze. The voice belonged to Brandon Pierce, a longtime customer at Ellsworth and Company, and one of the most arrogant, condescending men she had ever met. Rachel turned, her stomach sinking. Brandon stood near the entrance, flanked by 2 of his equally obnoxious friends. He was dressed in his usual expensive suit, designer watch glinting under the fluorescent lights. His smirk widened as he looked her up and down. "No way," he said, shaking his head with mock amusement. "You work here now?" Rachel clenched her jaw. "I mean, I always knew you were kind of a nightmare," Brandon continued, laughing. "But damn, I didn't think you'd fall this hard." Rachel heard a few customers whispering nearby. Employees glanced toward her, unsure if they should step in. Her old self would have snapped back, would have put him in his place. But she wasn't that person anymore. She forced a tight smile. "Is there something I can help you with today?" Brandon blinked before laughing again, nudging one of his friends. "Wow, look at that. The mighty Rachel Caldwell, actually offering to help someone." Rachel said nothing. Brandon's smirk twisted into something meaner. "You used to make people feel like garbage if they didn't fit your little high-class standards," he said. "Guess you know how it feels now, huh?" Rachel's hands clenched so hard that her nails dug into her palms. Because the worst part? He was right. Brandon shook his head. "Man, this is sad," he muttered. "Come on, let's go somewhere better." He turned to leave, but then something happened. A young woman stepped up to the register. She was in her early 20s, wearing a plain hoodie and faded jeans. She clutched a small shopping bag, her fingers trembling. Rachel's sharp instincts noticed everything instantly. The way the girl's eyes darted around nervously. The way she hunched her shoulders. The way she gripped the bag like she was afraid someone would take it. Then Rachel saw the cashier's face. Tense. Concerned. And that's when Rachel realized what was happening. The girl was being accused of shoplifting. Rachel barely had time to react before she heard Brandon's voice again. "Whoa," he laughed. "Look at this. First, Rachel gets demoted to retail worker, and now she's got to deal with actual criminals." Rachel's pulse spiked. She turned back to the girl who looked mortified. The cashier, a young man named Luke, was hesitant. "Miss, are you sure you paid for that?" he asked gently. Rachel could see it in the girl's face. She was about to break. Her old self wouldn't have cared. Her old self would have judged the girl based on her clothes, just like she had judged Shaq that day at Ellsworth. But now she knew what it was like to be looked at and assumed to be less. Rachel took a breath. Then she stepped forward. "She paid for it," Rachel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Luke hesitated. "Are you sure?" Rachel nodded, without a shred of doubt. "Yes." The girl looked up, eyes wide. Rachel turned to her and smiled. "You're good to go." The girl gave a small, grateful nod before hurrying out the door. Rachel turned back just in time to see Brandon shaking his head in disgust. "You really have changed," he muttered. "Come on, let's go somewhere better." He turned to leave, but then something happened. A young woman stepped up to the register. She was in her early 20s, wearing a plain hoodie and faded jeans. She clutched a small shopping bag, her fingers trembling. Rachel's sharp instincts noticed everything instantly. The way the girl's eyes darted around nervously, the way she hunched her shoulders, the way she gripped the bag like she was afraid someone would take it. Then Rachel saw the cashier's face, tense, concerned. And that's when Rachel realized what was happening. The girl was being accused of shoplifting. Rachel barely had time to react before she heard Brandon's voice again. "Whoa," he laughed. "Look at this. First, Rachel gets demoted to retail worker, and now she's got to deal with actual criminals." Rachel's pulse spiked. She turned back to the girl, who looked mortified. The cashier, a young man named Luke, was hesitant. "Miss, are you sure you paid for that?" he asked gently. Rachel could see it in the girl's face. She was about to break. Her old self wouldn't have cared. Her old self would have judged the girl based on her clothes, just like she had judged Shaq that day at Ellsworth. But now she knew what it was like to be looked at and assumed to be less. Rachel took a breath. Then, she stepped forward. "She paid for it," Rachel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Luke hesitated. "Are you sure?" Rachel nodded without a shred of doubt. "Yes." The girl looked up, eyes wide. Rachel turned to her and smiled. "You're good to go." The girl gave a small, grateful nod before hurrying out the door. Rachel turned back just in time to see Brandon shaking his head in disgust. "You really have changed," he muttered, "and not in a good way." Rachel exhaled, watching him carefully. "You think kindness is weakness, don't you?" Brandon scoffed. "I think if you'd had this attitude back at Ellsworth, you never would have made it as a manager." Rachel studied him. Then, for the first time in her life, she felt pity for him. Not anger, not resentment. Pity. She shook her head. "That's where you're wrong." Brandon rolled his eyes and turned to leave, but Shaq was already walking toward them. Rachel hadn't even noticed him standing there, watching, listening. Brandon stopped short, his face immediately shifting. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal." Shaq didn't look at him. He was looking at Rachel, and he was smiling. Not a smirk, not amusement. A real, genuine smile. Rachel felt something unravel inside her, because she knew what that smile meant. She had passed the test. Shaq clapped a heavy hand on Brandon's shoulder, making the smaller man nearly stumble. "Take care," Shaq said simply. Brandon swallowed hard and left without another word. The store settled into silence. Shaq turned to Rachel. "Come with me." Rachel followed him without hesitation. The office door shut behind them. Shaq leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "So," he said, watching her, "you finally get it?" Rachel met his gaze without fear. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I do." Shaq nodded slowly. "Then tell me, what did you learn?" Rachel took a deep breath. "That people aren't what they wear," she said. "That just because someone looks a certain way doesn't mean they should be treated differently." She exhaled. "That I was wrong." Shaq studied her. "And?" Rachel swallowed the last bit of her pride. "And I deserved what happened to me." Shaq smiled again. Rachel let out a shaky breath. "So what now?" Shaq stood up straight. "Now? We see what you can do with a second chance." Rachel frowned. "What does that mean?" Shaq grinned. "Means I got a job for you." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Shaq smirked. "Something way harder than selling overpriced watches." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "Which is?" Shaq's grin widened. "Making sure nobody else turns out like you." Rachel sat outside Shaq's office, her hands clenched together in her lap. She had been called up 30 minutes ago, but Shaq hadn't seen her yet. It felt intentional, like he wanted her to sit with the weight of everything that had happened. Rachel exhaled slowly, her foot tapping against the floor. She had been in this position before, waiting to be judged, waiting to be told if she was good enough. Back at Ellsworth, she had always been the one in control, deciding who rose and who fell. Now, for the first time, she was the one waiting for a verdict. She knew two things were possible. Either Shaq was about to give her a second chance, or he was about to shut the door forever. The office door finally opened. Rachel stood immediately, heart pounding. Shaq leaned against the doorframe, his face unreadable. "Come in." Rachel stepped inside. Shaq walked over to his desk, but he didn't sit. He didn't motion for her to sit either. Instead, he crossed his arms and asked one question. "What did you learn?" Rachel felt the air leave her lungs. She had expected a job offer. Maybe some final speech about second chances. But instead, Shaq was making her prove it. Rachel swallowed. She knew there was no point in lying, no point in giving some polished, rehearsed answer. This had to be real. She took a deep breath. "I learned," she started slowly, "that I was blind." Shaq's expression didn't change. Rachel forced herself to keep going. "I spent years thinking success was about power, about status. I thought people who worked minimum wage jobs were there because they weren't ambitious enough, because they weren't trying hard enough." She let out a bitter breath. "But I was wrong." Shaq watched her closely. Rachel's voice grew steadier. "People work hard. Harder than I ever did. They get disrespected every day and still show up. I thought I was better than them, but the truth is, I wouldn't have lasted a week in their shoes." She hesitated before saying the hardest part. "I judged people for things they couldn't control. And the worst part, I didn't even realize I was doing it." Shaq nodded slowly. Rachel exhaled. "I get it now." Shaq leaned back against the desk. "And what does getting it look like?" Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You say you've changed. You say you learned something, so tell me, what does that actually look like?" Rachel hesitated, because she didn't have an answer. What did change actually look like? Shaq let the silence sit. Then he sighed. "See, that's the real test." Rachel's brows furrowed. "Test?" Shaq smirked. "Yeah, learning something isn't just about realizing you were wrong. It's about doing something about it." Rachel felt her stomach twist. Shaq stood up straight, tilting his head. "So what are you gonna do?" Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because she didn't know. Shaq studied her reaction, then grinned. "Good," he said, nodding. "That means you're actually thinking about it." Rachel's heart was racing. Shaq walked over to the window, staring out at the city skyline. "Let me tell you something, Rachel. I've seen people like you my whole life. People who think money makes them better. People who learn the lesson for about 5 minutes before they fall right back into their old ways." Rachel flinched, because he was right. "So," Shaq continued, turning back to her, "are you going to be one of those people?" Rachel swallowed hard. This was it. The real test. Not the retail job. Not the humiliation. This. She had a choice. She could nod, say whatever Shaq wanted to hear, and walk out of here convincing herself that she had learned her lesson. Or she could actually do something. Rachel inhaled sharply. Then, for the first time, she spoke with absolute certainty. "I want to help people," she said. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? How?" Rachel's mind raced. Then, suddenly, she knew. She straightened. "I want to make sure no one ever gets treated the way I treated people." She exhaled. "People like me don't just pop up out of nowhere. We're created. We're raised to think a certain way, to act a certain way. We're told that success means standing above other people." Shaq nodded, waiting. Rachel swallowed. But what if it didn't? What if success was about how many people you lift up instead of how many people you step over? Shaq's lips curled into a smile. Rachel kept going. "I don't want my old job back. I don't want to go back to selling watches to people who think they're better than everyone else. I want to do something that actually matters." Shaq's expression softened. "Like what?" Rachel didn't hesitate. "I want to work for you." Shaq smirked. "You already do." Rachel shook her head. "Not in retail. I want to work on fixing what's broken." She exhaled. "There are people like me in every company, in every store, in every boardroom. People who don't even realize they're hurting others. I want to change that." Shaq studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled. Rachel frowned. "What?" Shaq shook his head, still grinning. "You really think you're ready for that?" Rachel's voice didn't waver. "Yes. Shaq stared at her for a few more seconds, then finally, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Shaq grabbed a folder off his desk and tossed it to her. "Your first project," he said. Rachel caught it, flipping it open. Inside were statistics, reports, complaints about workplace discrimination. Rachel's stomach tightened. Shaq crossed his arms. "You wanted a challenge? Fix this." Rachel stared down at the papers, her mind already racing with ideas. She looked back up at Shaq, a slow smile spreading across her face. For the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing status. She was chasing something real. And this time, she wasn't going to fail. Rachel stood in front of the mirror in her small apartment, adjusting the collar of her blazer. It wasn't designer. It wasn't custom-tailored. It was simple, functional. And for the first time in her life, she didn't care. She had spent years believing that power meant looking the part. That authority came from crisp lines, expensive fabrics, and price tags that screamed exclusivity. Now, she knew better. Real power wasn't in what you wore. It was in what you did. And today, she was about to do something that actually mattered. Shaq leaned back in his chair as Rachel stepped into his office. He had seen a lot of things in his life. Wins, losses, comebacks, collapses. But this was different. Rachel Caldwell, the woman who had once humiliated people for sport, who had worn arrogance like a second skin, stood before him as someone else entirely. There was no trace of entitlement in her posture, no manufactured confidence in her expression. She had changed. And not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Shaq gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Rachel obeyed, but there was no nervousness this time, just readiness. He slid a folder across the desk toward her. Rachel picked it up, flipping through the pages. The first thing she saw was the title, Head of Community Engagement. She blinked, looking up. "Wait, this isn't..." Shaq smirked. "Your old job? Number it's not." Rachel's stomach flipped. "But I thought..." Shaq exhaled. "If I wanted you back at Ellsworth, I could have sent you there weeks ago. But that's not where you belong anymore." He nodded toward the file. "You're gonna fix what's broken." Rachel stared. This wasn't just a second chance. This was redemption. Shaq leaned forward. "You're gonna make sure no one else walks into one of my businesses and gets treated the way I was." His voice hardened. "Or the way you treated people." Rachel swallowed. "I don't know if I can do this." Shaq chuckled. "Good. That means you're taking it seriously." Rachel's hands tightened around the folder. This was bigger than anything she had ever done. She had spent years feeding the very system she was now supposed to fix. And now, she had to tear it down. Shaq nodded toward the papers. "That's your first initiative. Hiring policies, customer treatment, employee training." He paused, watching her reaction. "You tell me what needs to change, and then we change it." Rachel felt the weight of it. It would have been easier to go back to Ellsworth, to slip back into a life of luxury, to prove she had learned her lesson and then move on. But this was work, the kind of work that mattered. Rachel closed the folder. "When do I start?" Shaq grinned. "You already did." 2 months later, Rachel walked into one of Shaq's luxury stores, not as a customer, not as a manager, as a force of change. Employees stiffened when they saw her. Some still remembered her from before. The woman who had once ruled Ellsworth with an iron grip, who had determined people's worth with a single glance. But Rachel wasn't here to intimidate. She was here to listen. She called a meeting, gathered the staff, and did something she had never done before. She asked them what they needed, not how to increase sales, not how to attract wealthier clients, what they needed to feel respected. For some, it was fair wages. For others, it was training on how to deal with difficult customers without fear of being fired. For many, it was simply a voice in the company that actually cared. Rachel took every note. Then, she made changes, real ones, and people noticed. Customers started realizing that employees actually wanted to help them, not just make a commission. Employees felt safer knowing they weren't going to be tossed aside over a complaint from a rich customer having a bad day. Rachel saw the shift, and for the first time, she felt proud. Not because she was in charge, but because she was making things right. One afternoon, as Rachel walked out of a meeting, she spotted a familiar figure near the entrance. A man in a simple hoodie, loose jeans, and worn-out sneakers. Shaq. Rachel smirked. "You're really committed to dressing like a broke customer, huh?" Shaq grinned. "Keeps people on their toes." Rachel crossed her arms. "Here to check up on me?" Shaq shook his head. "Already know you're doing good." He nodded toward the store. "I can feel it." Rachel knew exactly what he meant. The air inside wasn't tense anymore. Employees weren't walking on eggshells. Customers weren't throwing around their money like a weapon. It felt different. Because it was. Shaq exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Told you power isn't about standing above people." Rachel nodded, her voice firm. "It's about lifting them up." Shaq smiled. The lesson had sunk in. He clapped a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Keep going." Rachel smirked. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." Shaq chuckled. "Didn't think so." Then, with a nod of approval, he turned and walked outside, stepping into the daylight. Because he knew that he hadn't just fired someone that day at Ellsworth. He had changed them. And that was real power. Some lessons hit hard, some changed lives. And some, they flipped the entire game. You've seen what happens when power is used the wrong way. Now imagine what happens when it's used to build instead of break. The real question is, what would you have done in Rachel's place? Think about it, because someone, somewhere, is watching how you treat them.